A wine cellar no one built. No door, no plans, yet it's full. Welcome to Marple Mysteries. I am your host, Harrington. Tell me, where are you tuning in from today? Your comments truly make this community shine. Let's begin. I've seen Nero Wolfe's eyebrows twitch for a lot of reasons. Bad saffron, a gumshoe with too much cologne, once even a client who mistook his orchid schedule for a coat rack. But the twitch he gave when Ambrose Duval mentioned a secret wine, Cellar, that was new. It started like this. It was a Monday, which meant Wolfe was already in a foul mood because Fritz had decided to serve fish. I was at my desk sorting the mail when the doorbell rang. I got up, because let's face it, if Wolfe got up every time the bell rang, he'd weigh a slim 250, and opened the door. Standing there was a man who looked like he was upholstered. He in Italian wool and anxiety. Late 40s, thinning blonde hair, and the distinct whiff of a man who wasn't used to asking for help, but had gotten desperate enough to try. He introduced himself with a voice smoother than his nerves. Ambrose. Duval. I believe Mr. Wolfe was recommended to me by Mr. Rusterman. That name got my attention. Rusterman's restaurant was as sacred to Wolfe as oxygen, and the late Marko Vukcic had been one of his few true friends. I told Duval to come in before. The fish smell scared him off. Inside, Duval perched on the edge of the red leather chair like a man expecting an electric shock. Wolfe, of course, didn't even glance up from the yellow-stamped book he was reading, something on Burgundy vintages from 1890 to 1915, which was about as close to religion as he got. I cleared my throat. Client, boss, brought credentials, and looks like he knows what a decanter is for. That got Wolfe's eyes up barely. He set the book down with a grunt that meant proceed. Duval launched in. Mr. Wolfe, I own Duval Select Imports, fine wines and spirits. I've recently been approached to broker a collection, a private wine cellar allegedly hidden for decades in one of Manhattan's oldest townhouses. The authenticity of it is dubious, but if real, it would be worth a small fortune. Wolfe grunted again, this time more of an I'm listening but don't push your luck grunt. Duval leaned forward. The problem is, Mr. Wolfe, I've reason to believe the cellar, this so-called treasure trove, shouldn't exist. Not legally, not historically. There's no record of it, and yet some very powerful parties are desperate to get it quietly. Sold. I was already hooked, but Wolfe was about as stirred as a marble statue. He closed his eyes and said, Pfui, a fraud. A trifling concern for civil attorneys and antiquarians. Not for me. Duval shook his head. His hands fidgeted with the crease of his trousers. Mr. Wolfe, I don't think you understand. There have been threats, sabotage, and last night someone broke into my office, not to steal, but to plant evidence suggesting I knew more than I do. That got Wolfe's eyelids open. He didn't like trespass in any form, especially not the kind that snuck in and rearranged the furniture. Still, he played it cool. Mr. Duval, I do not chase burglars, nor authenticate musty bottles of vinegar, posing as wine. Duval's voice dropped low. I believe Marko would have wanted you to hear me out. Wolfe's lips pursed. Mentioning Marko was as close as you could get to pulling a fire alarm in Wolfe's brain without actually lighting the brownstone on fire. After a long pause, Wolfe flicked a hand toward me. Archie. Details. I pulled out my notebook with the smoothness of a magician. Duval provided them. The name of the alleged owner of the hidden cellar, a reclusive widow named Constance Byers. The address, a decaying townhouse in Gramercy Park, and the list of individuals who had, somehow, gotten wind of the cellar's existence and might do something reckless to get it. When Duval left 15 minutes later, Wolfe still hadn't agreed to take the case. He simply said, I shall consider it. Which, if you knew Wolfe, meant two things. One, he was already thinking about it. Two, he wouldn't budge an inch until he figured out how it suited his schedule, his appetite, and his sense of intellectual sport. I returned to my desk and found him gazing at the orchid wall with an expression I knew all too well. He was intrigued, and when Wolfe was intrigued, the world had a way of getting very interesting and very uncomfortable, very fast. Tuesday started like any other, meaning Wolfe was grumbling about the humidity. Fritz was experimenting with a new veal recipe, and I was thumbing through the morning mail for anything that wasn't a bill, a crank letter, or a catalogue Wolfe would insist I burn. At exactly 11:30, the universe hiccuped. It started with the doorbell. Again. I made my usual journey to the front door, figuring it was a delivery or a neighborhood kid selling overpriced candy bars for a school that didn't exist. I was halfway into a snappy rejection when I saw who it was. A woman, late 30s, red, hair in a no-nonsense knot, a tailored navy blue suit that screamed money but not new, and a frown that could slice hardwood. She carried herself like someone who had spent her life giving orders and wasn't about to start asking politely now. Archie. Goodwin, she said, as if confirming a rumor she didn't like. Last I checked, I replied. If you're looking to sell me a subscription, I warn you my boss doesn't like the smell of cheap ink. She didn't smile. I need to speak with Mr. Wolfe, immediately. That was my cue to stall, stonewall, and generally make life difficult. But something about her made me sidestep my better instincts. I ushered her inside, noting the tight grip she had on her leather folder. It was the kind of grip you give to things you don't trust anyone else to touch. Wolfe, still pretending to be absorbed in viticulture and its discontents, didn't look up when I announced her. Sir, we have a Miss, I turned toward her with a polite eyebrow. Lucinda Byers, she supplied crisply. Wolfe's eyes flickered open, barely, like a cat that had heard a can opener. Relation to Constance Byers, he asked. Her niece. Executor of her estate, Lucinda said, without offering a seat. And I understand someone came to you yesterday about a matter concerning our family property. Wolfe's mouth twisted, not in surprise, but in irritation. He didn't like his home being treated like a public square. I neither confirm nor deny the identities of my visitors, Wolfe said. Privacy is the currency of discretion. Lucinda didn't flinch. She stepped forward and dropped her folder onto my desk with a thud that rattled my coffee mug. I am here to tell you, she said, voice sharp as a tack, that there is no secret wine cellar. There never was. Any suggestion otherwise is either fabrication or fraud, and you would be wise to steer clear. Now that got Wolfe's attention. He sat back in his chair, steepling his fingers across the considerable expanse of his middle. Miss Byers, I have not accepted any engagement. I listen, I decide, I act or decline at my own pleasure. And if you choose to listen to thieves and liars, Lucinda snapped, you'll find yourself entangled in matters far uglier than old bottles of wine. She turned on her heel and marched to the door, giving me a glower in passing that could have burned a hole in the rug. I held it open for her because chivalry, in my experience, was an excellent way to needle a furious woman without actually getting sued. When the door clicked shut behind her, Wolfe let out a long, slow breath through his nose. Archie, he said without opening his eyes, fetch me a beer and after that summon Mr. Saul Panzer. That raised my eyebrows. Saul was Wolfe's go-to man for things that required a head for subtlety and a heart rate that stayed steady under fire. Panzer, I said. You expect this cellar business to turn bloody? Wolfe shook his head. I expect it to turn inconvenient. He tilted his chair back, closed his eyes again, and added, almost to himself, a thing that should not exist is often the most dangerous thing of all. I went to get the beer. Outside, a low cloud cover turned the day grey and heavy. Inside, the brownstone, a fortress, a temple, a sanctuary, had been disturbed. And if there's one thing I've learned about Nero Wolfe, it's that when his world gets disturbed, it's only a matter of time before someone regrets it. When Saul Panzer showed up, it wasn't with trumpets or fanfare. He just appeared like smoke. 1 second the room was empty. The next he was sitting on the arm of the red chair, thumbing a slim notepad, waiting for Wolfe's grunt of permission. If Wolfe had a son, and God help us if he ever did, he'd have wanted him to be Saul. Quiet, smart, and unflappable. While Fritz laid out a lunch that Wolfe half ignored, Saul got the briefing in clipped phrases. Duval, the mystery cellar, the Byers family's sudden case of the vapors. Saul listened, nodded once, and asked no questions. That's why Wolfe used him. After Saul left, Wolfe instructed me to use your animal charm, his words, to gather names. People who had their fingers in the wine pie, so to speak. It didn't take much squeezing. Duval, when prodded, coughed up a list the next morning, along with a sheepish apology for not mentioning it earlier. Apparently, discretion was a contagious disease among wine dealers. The list had 5 names. By Wolfe's standards, that was perfect. Not too few to be boring, not too many to require actual effort. I spent the next day arranging coincidental meetings with our charming little roster of suspects. Here's what I found. Lucinda Byers, the guardian, no shocker there. Miss Byers had been running her aunt's affairs since the old girl took to bed with nerves 2 years ago. Word from the family lawyer, a pinched little ferret named Munsey, was that Lucinda kept a tight lid on the estate, frowning on visitors, auditing staff like a treasury agent, and generally treating the townhouse like Fort Knox. Motives. Plenty. If a hidden cellar turned up, and it somehow wasn't listed in the estate, Lucinda could find herself facing a very awkward set of tax questions, and maybe a few criminal ones. Or maybe she didn't want anyone stirring up old family dirt. Gramercy Park families had skeletons like other people had closets. Still, if she was hiding something, she was playing it close to the vest. Not sloppy, not panicked, at least not yet. Thomas Kelleher. The connoisseur Thomas Kelleher was what happened when too much money met too little restraint. An independent appraiser of luxury assets, he was the sort who spent his days sniffing rare wines and nights sniffing around heiresses. I caught up with him at a tastings event at the Carlisle, where he was pontificating over a 1937 Pommard, like it was the Ark of the Covenant. When I casually mentioned the Byers collection, he nearly dropped his tasting glass. "Oh, that old ghost story," he said, laughing a shade too loud. "Pure nonsense. Old Constance was half mad for the last 20 years. He dismissed it, sure, but his hand trembled slightly when he refilled his glass. The man wasn't as relaxed as he wanted the world to think. If that cellar existed, and if he had a sniff it was valuable, he'd have motive to accelerate its disappearance, or reassign it into more appreciative hands. Sylvia Tiernan, the historian. Next up was Sylvia Tiernan, a local historian specializing in preservation through documentation. Translation, she made a living writing grant proposals and giving somber lectures to rich ladies who liked their heritage in small, expensive doses. She'd been hired 2 years ago by Lucinda to catalogue the Byers house for a potential landmark status, which meant she knew that place from attic to basement, and presumably all points in between. Sylvia was trim, efficient, and as emotionally expressive as a parking meter. When I pressed her on the possibility of a secret cellar, she sniffed. "Assure you," she said, adjusting her glasses, "if there were hidden vaults or private stockpiles, I would have found them." That sounded convincing, right up until she added, "Of course, certain renovations could have concealed things over the decades, especially during Prohibition." Bingo. So Sylvia knew enough to suspect a secret cellar, even if she hadn't found it. If someone offered her a fat enough check, or threatened to ruin her cushy consulting gigs, would she keep her mouth shut, maybe even help shuffle it out the back door? Yeah, maybe. Victor Temple. The broker Victor Temple ran a boutique auction house downtown that specialized in private acquisitions. In plain English, he sold rich people's family heirlooms without airing the dirty laundry. According to Duval, Temple had expressed loud interest in the possibility of lost buyers' assets turning up. When I popped into his office, cozy, oak-paneled and reeking of old money, he gave me the oily handshake of a man who always thought he was about to close a deal. "A hidden cellar. Intriguing," he said, beaming like a cat in a birdcage. "But strictly rumor, I assure you. These things surface all the time, Archie." "Yeah. And if it surfaced in Temple's hands first, he could rake in a small fortune selling it off bottle by bottle, no questions asked. If there was dirty work afoot, Temple had the motive, the opportunity, and, judging by the collection of vintage forgery cases in his past, the expertise. Perry Santorini, the fixer finally. There was Perry Santorini, a name that kept turning up in the shadowy corners of Duval's story. Perry was what polite society called a consultant, what everyone else called a fixer. If you had something to move quietly and without legal fuss, Perry was your man. I found him nursing a bourbon at a dive bar on Bleecker Street, a place where the cockroaches paid rent. Perry had a nose like a boxer and eyes like a disappointed uncle. When I mentioned the buyer's house, he laughed so hard he spilled his drink. "Wine cellars? Man, I don't even drink." He wiped his mouth. "I move furniture. Furniture that sometimes falls off the back of trucks. You understand?" I understood. He wasn't denying he was involved. He was bragging without admitting. If someone needed a secret cache emptied before the taxman, the press, or a cranky niece came sniffing, Perry was the guy who'd call in a crew with crowbars and flashlights, and maybe a bottle or two for his trouble. I got back to the brownstone at 6:15, in time to smell Fritz's chicken cacciatore and hear Wolfe bellowing for beer. I gave him the rundown in the office while he glared at the ceiling, weighing each name like he was picking teams for a chess match. When I finished, he nodded, eyes half-lidded. "Phooey," he said softly. "The cellar is real." I blinked. "You're sure?" "It must be. Else there would be no pressure, no intrusion, no trembling hands." I opened my mouth to argue, because that's my job, but he cut me off with a raised finger. "Archie, attend. They believe it exists. That suffices." He closed his eyes again. "Tomorrow," he said, "you will call on Miss Byers, firmly. Inform her we require an inspection." "And if she refuses?" I asked. "She will refuse," Wolfe said, smirking. "Slightly. That, too, is evidence." He folded his hands over his gut. Outside, the evening thickened into a humid, sticky twilight. Inside, in the cool, controlled confines of Wolfe's office, the trap was beginning to set, and the game, like a fine burgundy, was just starting to breathe. If there's a skill I pride myself on, besides my obvious charm and the ability to make a dame smile in under 30 seconds, it's getting people to talk when they'd rather wrestle a porcupine. Wolfe had made it clear, poke Miss Lucinda Byers until she popped, and if possible, get a look inside that old mausoleum she called home. The trick was to do it without getting my tie caught in the door on the way out. I called Miss Byers at precisely 9:30 in the morning, early enough to catch her unprepared, but late enough to avoid being hung up on as a telemarketer. She answered on the third ring, voice clipped as ever. "Miss Byers," I said, injecting just the right note of polite irritation, "it's Archie Goodwin, Mr. Wolfe's assistant. We require access to the Byers' residence at your earliest possible convenience." There was a pause long enough to make me check if she'd hung up. "I made myself clear," she said finally. "There is nothing to find." "Miss Byers," I said smoothly, "you hired a historian to document every crack in your baseboards. You've entertained 3 independent appraisers in the past 6 months. You can't suddenly claim complete ignorance when rumors start flying." She exhaled sharply. It wasn't quite a sigh. It was more the sound you make when you're weighing whether or not you can afford a lawsuit. "I will permit a visual inspection," she said stiffly. "No digging, no disruptions, no theatrics. Miss Byers, you have my solemn guarantee. Mr. Wolfe and I do not perform theatrics. We leave that to the district attorney when things get ugly." I booked a visit for 2 o'clock sharp. The Byers townhouse sat in the north end of Gramercy Park, a squat stone structure that looked like it had once been handsome before a century of dust and bad paint jobs got the better of it. The front steps sagged slightly, and the iron railings needed a fresh coat of black. It was the kind of place you walked by without noticing. Perfect if you wanted to hide something. Lucinda met me at the door, wearing a dress as stiff as her smile. Inside, the place smelled faintly of mothballs and ancient carpet. The front parlor was a mausoleum of heavy drapes and dark wood. Family portraits glowered from the walls, a long line of Byers' ancestors, none of whom looked like they had ever smiled in their lives. "We begin here," Lucinda said, leading me room by room with all the warmth of a museum docent guarding a national treasure. The tour was thorough, but suspiciously narrow. She avoided the service corridors, the back staircases, and the cellar door like they had smallpox. "So," I said casually, "no basement?" Her mouth tightened. "There is a basement. It is largely unused. Wouldn't mind a peek. Entirely unnecessary." "Miss Byers," I said, dropping the charm for a second and letting my voice flatten into something closer to the truth. "Either you let me see it now, or Mr. Wolfe will have no choice but to draw his own conclusions, loudly and publicly." That got her. She hesitated, then turned on her heel and led me through a narrow back hallway I hadn't noticed before. At the end was a thick oak door, bolted from the inside. Lucinda unlocked it with a key from her pocket. We descended into a narrow stairwell lined with stone. At the bottom, the basement sprawled out, low ceilings, bare bulbs, and more cobwebs than a Halloween store in August. Rusted shelving held a few battered crates. A furnace wheezed in one corner like it was dying of emphysema. Nothing suspicious at first glance. Nothing sparkling, no hidden doorways, no racks of dusty Romanée Conti bottles waiting for a bidding war. Still, something smelled off, and I don't mean the mildew. The far wall, where the foundation should have been a uniform stretch of stone, had a peculiar bulge, an unevenness you didn't have to be an architect to notice. And, more interestingly, the mortar looked newer than the rest. "Recent repairs?" I asked, gesturing casually. Lucinda's face stayed frozen. "A minor plumbing incident years ago. The wall was reinforced." "Sure," I said. I didn't push. Too soon. Spent a few more minutes poking around, making idle conversation, noting the layout and the strange absence of any wine racks or old storage markings. If there had ever been a secret cellar, it had been sealed tighter than Wolfe's wallet. Left with a firm handshake and a mental note, Miss Byers was hiding something. Whether it was an illegal stash of vintage Bordeaux or an old family scandal, I didn't know yet. But she was rattled, and that was good news. Next up was recon. Wolfe's orders were simple. Verify the recent repairs story without letting the buyer's name hit the wind. First stop, the City Building Archives. A charming pit of paper and sweat presided over by a clerk named Mrs. Kellerman, who liked me because I once helped her carry 3 filing boxes during a blackout. Over sandwiches. At her desk, I learned 2 important things. 1. No plumbing work had been filed for the buyer's property in the last 30 years. 2. However, a private foundation reinforcement permit had been quietly filed under a shell company 18 months ago. The contractor, a now defunct outfit tied to, you guessed it, Victor Temple's auction house. Interesting. Very interesting. My next stop was a quiet cup of coffee with an old acquaintance, Tony Koza, who ran a semi-legitimate crew of home renovators, and had a brother-in-law who once did some unofficial patch jobs around Gramercy. Tony leaned in over his espresso. The buyer's place? Yeah, I heard about that gig. Funny thing, though, they didn't call in foundation guys. They called in masons and night work too. Masons? I asked. As in walling something off? Tony said, winking, or hiding it. He leaned back and grinned. You didn't hear it from me, pal. By the time I made it back to the brownstone, my shoes were scuffed, my tie was crooked, and my notebook was burning a hole in my pocket. Wolfe was in the office, sitting in his throne, glaring at a crossword, puzzled like it owed him money. I dropped into the red chair and gave him the report step by step. He listened without a word, except for the occasional grunt of displeasure. When I finished, he nodded once. The cellar existed, he said. Still exists, merely entombed. And Lucinda Byers knows, I added. She knows or suspects. The distinction, Archie, is crucial. He reached for the bell pull to summon Fritz, signaling the conversation was over for now. As I rose, Wolfe added almost lazily, Tomorrow, you will pay a visit to Mr. Temple. Impress upon him the virtues of candor. And if he doesn't feel virtuous, I asked. Wolfe's smile was thin and unlovely. Then he shall feel pressure. The stage was set, the players uneasy and the game tightening like a noose. And as always, Nero Wolfe would never leave his chair, but every move, every breath, would go exactly as he planned. The thing about Nero, Wolfe's strategies is that they aren't really strategies in the way normal people think. Normal people strategize like they're juggling apples, trying to keep all the pieces in the air. Wolfe strategizes like he's setting traps in a chess game 6 moves ahead, except the board is real life, and the stakes are slightly higher than bragging rights. Which is why when I left the brownstone that morning to pay my courtesy call on Victor Temple, I knew better than to think this would be a polite conversation. Temple's auction house was a high-gloss operation perched above a jewelry store on Madison Avenue. Walking in, you'd think you were entering a library curated by millionaires. Glass cases, velvet ropes, and little tags that screamed, "You can't afford this." Temple himself met me in a private side room, walnut-paneled, leather chairs, the works. He wore a blue-checked suit and an expression that said he was already bored. "Mr. Goodwin," he said, gesturing at a seat without standing up. "You honor me." I sat, crossing my legs casually. "Cut the flattery, Mr. Temple. We both know why I'm here." His smile flickered. "I have no idea." "You brokered a construction crew to reinforce the buyer's foundation," I said, keeping my voice light. "You didn't file it under your own name, because you didn't want it traced back, which is funny considering there's allegedly nothing there worth hiding." Temple shrugged. "Real estate preservation is a murky business." "Sure," I said, "but it's even murkier when it's done at night with unlicensed masons." His smile dropped half an inch. I leaned in. "Listen, Temple, I don't care about your side hustles. What I care about is this. Either you tell me why you helped seal that cellar, or Mr. Wolfe goes public with the fact that a respected auctioneer facilitated the disappearance of potential historic assets." He narrowed his eyes. "You'd be implicating your own client. Not if my client's the one being cheated." That made him blink for a moment. The only sound was the faint hum of an air conditioner. Finally, Temple exhaled and steepled his fingers. "All right, off the record?" I didn't move. "I was approached 18 months ago," Temple said. "Not by Lucinda, by a third party who claimed knowledge of the hidden cellar. They wanted it sealed, quickly, quietly. The excuse was structural. Instability. I got a crew, they walled it up, end of story. Who was the third party? I don't know their name, paid in cash. Eastern European accent. Could have been hired muscle or middle management. That, coming from Temple, meant he'd been paid enough to not know." I thanked him with a smile that didn't reach my eyes and left him polishing his already slippery conscience. By the time I got back to the brownstone, Wolfe was in the plant rooms. communing with his orchids. Fritz sent me upstairs with a glass of milk and a note. Patience, timing essential. I knew better than to interrupt an orchid session unless I wanted to be fed to the compost pile, so I parked myself in the office and flipped through old issues of Gourmet until Wolfe deigned to reappear. At 4 o'clock sharp he emerged, smelling faintly of moss and disapproval. I gave him the Temple report, adding every eyebrow twitch and double meaning. He listened in silence, then sat heavily in his chair and closed his eyes. "We are missing a piece," he said finally. "You think Temple's lying? No, he is merely ignorant." I opened my mouth to ask what that meant when the doorbell rang. Fritz answered, and a minute later he announced, "Mr. Ambrose Duval." Our wine merchant entered, looking about 15 years older than the last time we'd seen him. His tie was askew, his eyes red-rimmed. I had to come," he said, dropping into the red chair without waiting for an invitation. Wolfe arched an eyebrow. "Indeed." Duval ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Someone broke into my office again." "Again?" I asked. "This time," Duval said, voice shaking, "they didn't just rearrange the files, they stole them." That got Wolfe to sit up a fraction of an inch, a movement that for him counted as a standing ovation. "All of them?" Wolfe asked. "No, just the buyer's documents. Every note, every sketch, every confidential memo." I whistled low. "And?" Wolfe prompted. Duval hesitated. Then he pulled something out of his breast pocket, a single sheet of crisp cream-colored paper, and handed it to Wolfe. It was a typed note. No signature, just a simple, ugly message. "Stay out of it. The cellar belongs to those who deserve it. Next time it won't be just papers missing." Underneath that, a crude sketch of a wine bottle snapped in half. Wolfe read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the desk. "As if it might bite him. Archie," he said, his voice cool and precise, "arrange for Mr. Panzer to guard the brownstone tonight." I stiffened. Wolfe didn't call in guards unless he believed there was a real threat. To him. "Think they'll come?" "Here?" I asked. "They will come," Wolfe said grimly, "because they have misunderstood something crucial." "And what's that?" He smiled, thin and sour. "That I will be dissuaded by threats." He rose, actually rose, and stalked toward the kitchen, leaving me staring after him. Duval looked ready to faint. Should I leave town?" he stammered. "No." Wolfe called back from the hall. "Stay exactly where you are. Those who are desperate enough to act will reveal themselves." He disappeared into the kitchen. I looked at Duval, who looked back at me like I was the last solid object on a rapidly sinking ship. "Relax," I told him. "You're safer in this house than the Federal Reserve," which wasn't technically true but sounded good enough to keep him seated. The brownstone was no longer just disturbed. It had been invaded, threatened, marked. And Wolfe, who hated nothing more than disorder under his own roof, was about to make someone very, very sorry. You can say a lot of things about Saul Panzer, but the most important thing is this. If he's watching your house, nobody's getting in unless they're small enough to crawl through a keyhole. He showed up at 7, on the dot, wearing a nondescript brown suit and carrying a thermos of black coffee. When I opened the door, he gave me a brief nod and slipped inside like he'd always been there. Wolfe had him set up in the front room with the curtains cracked just enough for a good view of the street. Saul didn't need much. A chair, a line, of sight and time. As far as he was concerned, it was just another night at the office, except the office was our sacred brownstone, and the stakes were a little more personal. After dinner, Duval sat fidgeting in the office, his face twitching, every time the house settled, or a car backfired in the street. Wolfe pretended not to notice, engrossed in his book, The Romance of Wine, something that had more footnotes than actual romance. At 9, I made a sweep of the house, windows locked, doors bolted, backyard clear. Fritz armed himself with a carving knife long enough to serve double duty as a broadsword, and even the orchids got a check to make sure nobody had decided to poison Wolfe through his precious plants. We were ready, or as ready as you can ever be when you're expecting the unexpected. At 10:30, Saul tapped on the office door. Wolfe didn't look up from his book. "Report." Saul leaned in. "A car's been parked across the street for 40 minutes. Black. Certain? 2 men inside, no movement, no lights." I got up and went to the window, keeping to the shadows. Sure enough, across the way, there was the vague outline of a car. It was the kind of vehicle you don't notice unless you're looking for. It had no bumper stickers, no flashy trim, just plain black and forgettable. "They watching us?" I asked. "Not obviously," Saul said. "Could just be waiting for someone, but odds are they're here for you." He said it like he was commenting on the weather. Wolfe grunted. "They are not here for Mr. Goodwin. They are here for Mr. Duval and for me." He closed the book and laid it on the table with slow, deliberate precision. "We shall proceed." He instructed Saul to remain on watch and sent Fritz to prepare a late tray. Then he turned to Duval. "Mr. Duval, you will remain here tonight, in the south guest room. Archie will retrieve your belongings from your office in the morning. You are not to leave this house without my explicit consent." Duval nodded, looking half relieved and half terrified. "And me, boss?" I asked. "You, Archie, will pay a visit to Perry Santorini." "Tonight." I raised an eyebrow. "Now?" "Now," Wolfe said firmly. "He is the pivot, the one who moves for others. If there is to be a further escalation, it will be through him." I shrugged into my coat. "If I don't come back, save me a slice of Fritz's apple tart." Wolfe didn't smile. He just nodded once, which, coming from him, was almost emotional. Perry. Santorini wasn't hard to find. He had a consulting office above a second-hand furniture store on Houston Street, where the smell of varnish and stale coffee competed for dominance. When I knocked, there was a scuffle inside, probably Perry making sure he wasn't about to be served with papers or a subpoena, and then the door opened. Perry, in his usual too-tight suit, looked me up and down like I was a bomb he wasn't sure had been defused. "Goodwin," he said, leaning in the doorway. "What do you want?" "Conversation," I said. "Friendly, if possible." He grunted and let me in. The office was worse than I remembered. Sagging couch, battered desk, walls stained yellow from a lifetime of cheap cigars. "You're poking around where you shouldn't," Perry said as I sat. "That's practically my job." "Description." He barked a laugh that had no humor in it. "Listen," he said, leaning forward. "You don't understand how this works. The cellar, that's not yours to uncover. It's not Duval's either. Some things are better left buried." "Is that a threat?" "No," he said, and to his credit, he almost sounded sincere. "It's advice." I leaned in. "Who hired you to move the goods, Perry?" He shook his head. "You think it's that simple? You think it's just about wine? You think it's dusty bottles and a fat paycheck? What is it then?" He stared at me, his jaw working like he was chewing glass. Finally, he said, "It's not just wine, it's documents, records, stuff that's been hidden a long time, stuff that could ruin people, big people." He stood up and crossed to the window, peeking out like he expected to see a firing squad. "You're playing with fire, Goodwin, and you're dragging Wolfe into it. You need to walk away." "Not happening." He turned back to me, face hard. "Then you better watch your back." I stood. "Thanks for the warning," I said. I left him staring after me, the stink of fear heavy in the air. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe listened to the report with half-closed eyes. "Documents," he murmured. "Of course." He leaned back in his chair, hands folded across his middle. "Archie, you will have Saul follow Perry Santorini tomorrow. Discreetly. I want to know everyone he meets." "Understood." "And," Wolfe added, "prepare an invitation. We shall have guests tomorrow evening." My eyebrows climbed my forehead. "Already?" "Already," Wolfe said. "The pattern is clear. Now, we must accelerate. The denouement before others force our hand." He closed his eyes. "Go. I require silence." I left him in the darkened office, Saul still perched silently by the window, Duval curled up in the guest room like a mole in hiding, and the weight of something old, dangerous and unfinished pressing against the brownstone's heavy walls. The cellar that shouldn't exist was about to come into the light. When Nero Wolfe decides it's time to move, it doesn't look like much from the outside. No running, no shouting, no frantic scrambling. It's more like watching a glacier decide to rearrange a few mountains. Quiet. Slow. Inevitable. The morning after my little fireside chat with Perry Santorini, Wolfe summoned me and Saul to the office at 9 sharp, an event rare enough that I almost checked the calendar for an eclipse. Wolfe was seated, hands steepled, glaring at a point in mid-air that probably represented whoever had disturbed his peace most recently. Saul sat with the patience of a man who'd once played a 12-hour surveillance game without blinking. "Gentlemen," Wolfe began, "the time has come to compress the issue." I suppressed a groan. Wolfe, in full command mode, didn't brook interruptions. He continued, "The cellar exists. That is now beyond reasonable doubt. It contains more than wine, documents, evidence damaging to certain individuals or families. Its discovery would be inconvenient to some. Those persons have already resorted to burglary and threats. They will escalate." He paused to sip his beer, as calm as if he were reciting a shopping list. "We shall bait the hook." "Bait it with what?" I asked. Wolfe smiled grimly. "With the prospect of exposure." He outlined the plan with precision. An invitation. We would issue formal notices to Lucinda Byers, Ambrose Duval, Victor Temple, Sylvia Tiernan, Thomas Kelleher, and Perry Santorini. They were invited, or rather summoned, to a private meeting at the brownstone that evening to clarify the matter of the cellar. Wolfe would hint through me that he had obtained irrefutable proof of the cellar's existence and contents. Controlled release. Saul would leak discreetly that Wolfe had come into possession of original documents tied to the Byers estate. He would accidentally let it slip at 2 or 3 known watering holes where Temple's informants and Santorini's pals liked to loiter. Observation. We would monitor reactions. If panic set in, it would expose the guilty. If resistance hardened, Wolfe would break it down verbally, methodically, as only he could. In short, Wolfe was playing the long odds, and he was putting himself dead center in the spotlight to do it. 11 o'clock. The invitations went out by messenger. Each envelope was heavy, cream-colored, formal enough to rattle the nerves of anyone already feeling shaky. By noon, Saul had completed his leaks. He reported, with his usual lack of drama, that Perry Santorini had left his office in a visible sweat, and that Victor Temple had made 3 urgent phone calls before slamming his door and posting a "closed for private appointments" sign. Around 2. A delivery van idled suspiciously outside the brownstone for 5 minutes before driving off. Fritz caught the license plate, and Saul traced it to a moving and storage company with exactly 1 employee and no listed address. Wolfe wasn't impressed. "Small men with small imaginations," he said. I couldn't argue. At precisely 7 o'clock, the guests began arriving. First was Lucinda Byers, dressed in the same navy suit, her mouth compressed into a thin line of battle readiness. Behind her came Sylvia Tiernan, clutching a slim leather folder like it was body armor. Then Thomas Kelleher, looking slick and nervous in a pinstriped suit he hadn't filled out quite, as well as he thought. Victor Temple swaggered in next, trailing the scent of expensive cologne and a cloud of barely concealed panic. Finally, Perry Santorini arrived. No smile, no handshake, just a grim nod, as if he were reporting for execution. Wolfe remained seated behind his desk, mountainous, serene. I herded the suspects into the office and arranged them in chairs as if setting pieces on a chessboard. "Good evening," Wolfe said, his tone as dry as dust. "Thank you for coming." Nobody thanked him back. No surprise. Wolfe folded his hands on the desk. "You are here," he said, "because of your connection to the late Mrs. Constance Byers and her estate. Specifically, a matter concerning a wine cellar." Several people shifted in their seats. I noted it. "It has come to my attention," Wolfe continued, "that the cellar in question contains not merely vintage wines, but materials of a different, more sensitive nature. Materials whose exposure would cause considerable discomfort to certain parties." Lucinda Byers stiffened visibly. Temple's hand crept toward his breast pocket, where he probably kept a stress relief cigarette. "Therefore," Wolfe said, voice rising just slightly, "I have concluded that someone among you has acted, or intends to act, to prevent discovery." He let that sink in. Nobody spoke. "Tonight," Wolfe said, "we shall have clarity." He nodded at me. "Show time." I stepped forward, holding a small sealed envelope. "This envelope," I said, "contains a detailed description of the Byers wine cellar, its contents, and the identity of the party who commissioned its concealment." That was a lie. The envelope was empty, but nobody needed to know that yet. The room practically vibrated with tension. "I will open this envelope in 1 hour," Wolfe said. "If no one wishes to speak before then, I shall proceed to name names." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Wolfe leaned back, closed his eyes, and appeared to nap. I knew better. He was listening. Every shift, every breath, every suppressed cough. 20 minutes in, Thomas Kelleher cracked. First, he started tapping his foot, then tapping harder, until the sound was loud enough to be a small drum roll. Finally, he blurted out, "This is absurd. There's no proof. You're bluffing." Wolfe didn't open his eyes. "Am I?" Kelleher stood up, pacing. "You can't ruin reputations based on fairy tales." Wolfe opened one eye lazily. "You speak of reputations, Mr. Kelleher, yet you know nothing of the cellar's contents?" Kelleher's mouth opened, then closed again. "Gotcha." Next was Temple. He rose too, more controlled but no less rattled. "This is extortion," he said coldly. "Pure and simple." Wolfe chuckled, a dry, humorless sound. "Extortion implies I seek personal gain, Mr. Temple. I do not. I seek truth." Temple glared at him, then at me, then sat down heavily, muttering under his breath. 45 minutes in, Perry Santorini spoke. "You want the truth?" he said, voice low and bitter. "Fine." The cellar was sealed on orders from someone with a lot more to lose than the rest of us. Not wine, papers, old financial records, blackmail material from the Prohibition days, names that still carry weight. "Whose names?" Wolfe asked without inflection. "I don't know," Perry said. "I swear. I was told to move the stuff, not read." Lucinda Byers was pale as chalk. "And you, Miss Byers?" Wolfe asked. She straightened her back. "I knew. There were rumors. But Aunt Constance insisted it was better left buried, that it was dangerous. And yet you sought to conceal it permanently." Lucinda's lips compressed into a bloodless line. "I did what was necessary to protect my family," she said. "At the cost of theft, fraud, and conspiracy," Wolfe asked mildly. The room fell silent again, the weight of their actions settling like dust on old stone. Wolfe reached for the envelope. He tapped it once against the desk. "I have what I need," he said. The trap was sprung. Now came the final move. Wolfe didn't open the envelope. He didn't have to. By the time he set it carefully back down on the desk, the room was practically crackling with guilt. Lucinda Byers, rigid and pale, stared at the wall as if sheer denial could will her problems away. Perry Santorini slouched in his chair, resigned. to a fate he knew he couldn't talk his way out of. Thomas Kelleher still fidgeted like a man who'd swallowed a ticking clock. Victor Temple wore a mask of cold disdain, but the twitch in his jaw gave him away. Sylvia Tiernan just sat quietly, arms folded, observing the meltdown like an anthropologist studying a slow-motion train wreck. Wolfe, as ever, was the eye of the storm, immovable, calm, and thoroughly in charge. He let the silence marinate for another 30 seconds before speaking. "You may wonder why I convened you here instead of turning this matter over to the police," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It is because what has occurred is not yet a criminal matter, though it dances on the edge." He paused, tapping a finger on the desk. "You concealed the existence of the cellar. You conspired to destroy or hide material evidence. Some of you acted out of fear, some out of greed, and some out of an archaic, misplaced sense of loyalty." His gaze settled briefly on Lucinda before moving on. "But understand this. Any further concealment or obstruction will not be tolerated. If necessary, I will expose the entire affair to the authorities, the press, and anyone else who will listen." He leaned forward slightly, a motion so small, so deliberate, that it made everyone in the room lean back instinctively. "I have no particular passion for scandal," Wolfe said, "but I do have a passion for order and for truth." He gestured toward me. "Archie." I stood, pulling out my notebook. "The facts are these," I said briskly. Constance Byers inherited the townhouse during the 1920s. During Prohibition, she and her husband, one Wallace Byers, operated an illicit wine and liquor distribution network hidden behind the facade of legitimate real estate dealings. Several eyebrows rose at that, but nobody interrupted. To protect their enterprise, they kept meticulous records, client lists, payoffs, smuggling routes, you name it. When Prohibition ended, those records became liabilities, so they were hidden, walled up quite literally, in the secret cellar. I closed the notebook with a snap. Constance Byers knew those records could destroy reputations, families, fortunes. She kept the secret, and when she grew old, she passed the burden to her niece. Lucinda closed her eyes briefly, as if bracing for a blow. "But," I continued, "recent financial strains on the Byers estate, lawsuits, back taxes, forced Lucinda to consider selling off family assets. That's when word of the secret cellar leaked." I paced slowly, letting the tension stretch. Temple wanted to broker the goods for a fat commission. Kelleher wanted to authenticate and sell the vintage wines separately. Tiernan, I turned to Sylvia, who merely raised one eyebrow in acknowledgement, had her own interests in preserving the historical cachet and securing her consulting fees. And Perry Santorini, I added, was brought in to make sure the cellar and its contents disappeared before too many questions could be asked. Perry just shrugged. No denial, no protest. Wolfe shifted in his chair, the leather creaking slightly under the strain. "The cellar," Wolfe said, "was sealed under Temple's arrangements, with Santorini overseeing the operation. Lucinda, whether explicitly or tacitly, allowed it, believing that burying the past would safeguard her family's future." He laced his fingers together, but once word of a potential hidden trove circulated, others, buyers, appraisers, rival dealers, began sniffing around. The situation grew unstable. A second break-in at Duval's office was the tipping point. He turned his gaze to Duval, who sat silently against the far wall. "You, Mr. Duval, were targeted not because you were a threat, but because you were ignorant. Your knowledge or lack thereof was a potential risk. Those responsible feared you might stumble upon the truth by accident." Duval swallowed hard but said nothing. Wolfe sat back. "This cannot continue." He gestured once more to me, and I pulled a second envelope from my pocket. "In here," I said, "is a written account, witness statements, timeline, corroborating evidence, ready for the district attorney should Mr. Wolfe choose to send it." Temple muttered something under his breath that sounded unpleasant. "You have one alternative," Wolfe said, voice cutting through the murmuring like a razor. "You will unseal the cellar under proper supervision. You will surrender any historical materials to the appropriate preservation authorities, and you will accept a mediated settlement to compensate any financial parties harmed by this conspiracy. Let that sink in, or," he said softly, "you will deal with the consequences." It wasn't a threat. Wolfe never threatened. He merely stated outcomes as if they were weather forecasts. Slowly, reluctantly, the room began to crumble. Temple was the first to nod, tight and furious. Kelleher followed, muttering about lawyers. Perry didn't even bother pretending to object. He just slumped lower in his chair. Lucinda took the longest, her hands clenched in her lap, the knuckles white. She stared at Wolfe with something that wasn't quite hatred and wasn't quite admiration. Finally, she said, "Very well." Her voice cracked slightly on the words. Wolfe inclined his head a fraction, an acknowledgement of a worthy adversary conceding. After the guests filed out, some mumbling excuses, others avoiding each other's eyes, the brownstone slowly returned. To its familiar heavy silence, Fritz appeared with a tray of beer and cold roast beef sandwiches. Wolfe gestured for me to join him, and I dropped into my chair, exhausted. "You think they'll actually follow through?" I asked. Wolfe sipped his beer, savoring it. "They will," he said, "because they are not fools. Not entirely." He set down the glass and steepled his fingers again. "Fear is a more efficient motivator than virtue, Archie." Cheerful thought. "Accurate," he said. He reached for his sandwich, and for a few minutes the only sounds were the clink of glasses and the quiet hum of the city outside. Another case closed. Another tangled web straightened out. If not cleaned, at least neatly folded and tucked away. That's Nero Wolfe for you. Not a crusader, not a hero, just a man who couldn't abide disorder and made sure the world knew it. Wolfe didn't attend. In person, of course. No force on earth short of an orchid fire or a 10-alarm butter shortage could have dragged him out of the brownstone. Instead, he dispatched me to supervise, armed with a sheaf of instructions so detailed they included contingencies for weather, bad manners, and incorrect flashlight batteries. Lucinda Byers was there, stiff and brittle as frozen reeds. So was a city preservation official Wolfe had demanded attend, one of those humorless bureaucrats who loved forms and footnotes. Victor Temple came, wearing a grimace like it was a necktie. Kelleher stayed away, pleading ill health. I figured. He just didn't want his fingerprints anywhere near the scene of the crime. The workmen took down the newer wall with slow, cautious swings of their hammers. Wolfe had specified minimal damage to the original structure, full cataloguing of all removed material, and photographic evidence at every stage. I stood there, arms crossed, watching dust rise in slow plumes. Behind the false wall was another door, older, oak, reinforced with iron bands. Locked. Lucinda produced a small brass key from her purse, as if she had expected this moment, and dreaded it. She hesitated, then turned the key. The lock gave with a groan like an old man getting out of bed. Inside was a space no bigger than a generous pantry, stone walls, low ceiling, and the cold smell of age and damp earth, and yes, bottles, hundreds of them, stacked neatly and handmade. Wooden racks, their labels yellowed but intact. The names read like a who's who of pre-war French viticulture: Chateau Margaux, Petrus, Romanée Conti. But that wasn't all. In the far corner, stacked in wooden crates and tied with rotting twine, were several dusty ledgers and what looked like a small trunk. The preservation officer practically squealed with glee. He set about photographing everything like a kid in a candy store, documenting each label and page with solemn bureaucratic reverence. Lucinda stood in the doorway, watching with an expression that mixed grief, pride, and pure terror. "You want me to open it?" I asked, indicating the trunk. She nodded mutely. The latch was stiff but gave way under pressure. Inside were bundles of papers, receipts, coded ledgers, shipping manifests, personal letters. Many bore familiar names, families still powerful in the city today. Deals made in whispered backrooms, payoffs to politicians, blackmail material. A hidden history of Manhattan's aristocracy, written in ink and sealed in dust. It was dynamite, and Wolfe had known it. I didn't touch anything further. Instead, I made detailed notes, took photographs, and locked the door behind me when we left, leaving the cellar sealed again, for now, under city custody pending formal disposition. I took the first cab I could find back to the brownstone, where Wolfe awaited like a spider sitting quietly in the middle of an enormous web. He listened to my full report without interruption, eyes half closed, lips pursed thoughtfully. When I finished, he reached for his beer. "The wine?" he asked. "Probably worth $500,000 on its own," I said. "Maybe more at auction. And the documents? Enough to start a few scandals, bankrupt some trust funds, and probably trigger a libel lawsuit or two." Wolfe nodded approvingly. "Good." He didn't smile. Wolfe rarely smiled. But there was a deep, almost satisfied stillness to him, like a puzzle had clicked into place exactly the way he wanted. "Lucinda Byers?" he asked. "Cooperating," I said. "She's agreed to let the city archive the documents. In exchange, the estate gets a generous tax abatement and no public scandal." "Ann Temple, trying to spin it as a heroic preservation act," I said, smirking. "Nobody's buying it, but he'll probably survive with only a few bruises." "Perry Santorini, gone underground for now, probably onto his next unsavory job." Wolfe grunted. "He will re-emerge when he believes it's safe. Jackals are patient." He picked up the envelope from the previous gathering, the one that had been empty the whole time, and tossed it into the wastebasket with a lazy flick. It landed perfectly. The next evening, Saul Panzer stopped by for a debrief. Wolfe allowed him in only after confirming he hadn't brought anything resembling work. Fritz laid out a light supper, cold beef tongue, pickled vegetables, and a pie that would have made grown men weep. We ate in comfortable silence, the tension of the last week easing out of the house like steam. When dessert arrived, Wolfe finally deigned to speak at length. "The cellar," he said, "was a metaphor." Saul raised an eyebrow, and even I looked up from my pie. "Metaphor, sir?" "Indeed," Wolfe said. "A symbol of human frailty, our endless, foolish desire to bury inconvenient truths rather than confront them." He poured himself another glass of beer. "The Byers family tried to hide their sins under stone and mortar. Their descendants tried to pretend the past was dead. But the past, Archie, is never dead. It merely sleeps, and when awakened improperly, it strikes." He paused, savoring the words almost as much as the beer. Better to air the rot than let it fester. He leaned back, satisfied. Saul wiped his mouth with a napkin and said, "You planning to write that down, Mr. Wolfe?" "Phooey," Wolfe said, almost, smiling. "I have better uses for my time." I pushed my plate back and stood. "Well," I said, "at least now we know. If you ever retire from detective work, you've got a future in philosophy." Wolfe gave me a baleful look that suggested that if I didn't shut up, I'd be philosophizing about unemployment instead. I saluted and headed for the door. Outside, the city buzzed on, oblivious to the fact that a few of its oldest, dustiest skeletons had been dragged blinking into the light. Inside, the brownstone settled back into its usual rhythm, silent, orderly, and impregnable. Another case closed. Another secret bottled, uncorked, and neatly labeled for posterity. All in a day's work, for Nero Wolfe and his faithful errand boy, Archie Goodwin. There's a rhythm to life at the brownstone, a pulse that, if you listen close enough, beats steady and unchanging. Breakfast at 8, orchids at 9, clients at 11, beer at 4, dinner at 7. Cases come and go, names change, fortunes rise and fall. But inside those heavy stone walls the world bends to Wolfe's will. When a case disrupts that rhythm, as the buyer's cellar had, it leaves ripples, some deeper than others. It took a full week for those ripples to smooth themselves out. Lucinda Byers, true to her word, formally deeded the historical materials, both the scandalous and the sublime, to the city's preservation board. In return, the estate dodged a financial death spiral, and she retained enough face to hold her head high at the club meetings where old New York still played bridge and plotted fundraisers. Victor Temple tried to spin the event as an extraordinary rescue of Manhattan's cultural heritage, a phrase that gave me indigestion just reading it in The Times. Perry Santorini vanished like smoke. Last rumor had him working security for a casino opening in Atlantic City. As for Kelleher, he sent a stiff letter threatening to sue everyone in sight, then quietly went to ground, hoping the story would pass without anyone kicking over the rocks he was hiding under. Ambrose Duval re-emerged, blinking into polite society, his reputation a little bruised but intact. He even sent Wolfe a case of vintage Armagnac as a thank you. Wolfe didn't say thank you in return, of course. He just stacked the bottles neatly in his personal cellar and instructed Fritz to label them properly, and Wolfe himself he treated. The entire episode as if it were a slightly distasteful meal. He was determined not to let sour his digestion. One evening, about a week after the cellar was resealed and secured, I found myself sitting across from Wolfe in the office, a beer in one hand and a piece of apple tart in the other. The storm had passed. The brownstone was quiet, humming with the comfortable sounds of Fritz bustling in the kitchen, the orchids breathing gently under their glass shelters upstairs. "You know," I said casually, "for a guy who hates leaving his house, you sure do. Managed to cause a lot of earthquakes in the outside world." Wolfe lifted an eyebrow but didn't look up from the book he was leafing through, an inquiry into the origins of wine cultures. "I do not cause earthquakes, Archie. I reveal their fault lines." "Nice," I said. "Very poetic. You should embroider that on a pillow," he grunted, a sound I had come to recognize over the years as the Wolfian equivalent of sticking out his tongue. I took a sip of beer and let my mind wander back over the whole mess. The secret cellar, the buried scandals, the way everyone involved had tried to pretend the past was just dead paper. "You really think it was the cellar itself they were afraid of?" I asked, "or what it made them remember?" Wolfe closed his book slowly, carefully. "Memory," he said, "is the heaviest burden humanity carries, heavier even than guilt. A secret cellar, a forgotten trove. Those are symbols, not threats. It is the memory of past cowardice, past corruption, that terrifies." He leaned back, steepling his fingers across the considerable acreage of his chest. "People," he said, "will move heaven and earth to pretend that what has happened did not." I considered that for a moment, watching the way the late evening light slanted across the polished surface of the desk. "You ever think about building your own cellar, sir?" I asked. "Something to hide all the stuff you don't want to admit?" He snorted. "I require no such contrivance. My past is simple. I have never committed a crime, I have betrayed no one. And my mistakes, such as they are, I have memorized in detail. Must be nice," I said dryly. "All tidy like that." "It is essential," Wolfe said, "if one wishes to live with oneself." He reached for his beer, sipped and set it down again. "Most men," he said, "live in sprawling mansions of denial. I prefer a modest, well-kept apartment of truth." He closed his eyes, signaling that as far as he was concerned, the discussion was over. A few minutes later, Fritz came in with a tray and quietly set down 2 small plates of walnut cake. Wolfe's reward for surviving another brush with the corrupt and the careless. I stayed long enough to finish my slice, then stood and stretched, "Well," I said, "the cellar's sealed. The skeletons are back in their closets and the brownstone's back to smelling like roast chicken instead of conspiracy." Wolfe opened one eye and regarded me. "Pfui," he said. "It always smelled of conspiracy." "Only the flavor has changed." I grinned and grabbed my jacket. "Good night, sir," I said, heading for the door. As I reached the hall, Wolfe called after me. "Archie," I turned. "You are, for all your impertinence, a satisfactory assistant." I blinked. That was high praise by Wolfe's standards. Practically a standing ovation. "Don't get mushy on me, sir," I said. "You'll ruin your reputation." He grunted again and waved me off like a particularly persistent fly. Outside, the night was warm, the city humming its endless lullaby of traffic and late-night laughter. I walked to the corner, hands in my pockets, thinking about hidden cellars, old sins and the way Wolfe had once again dragged the truth out into the light, whether anyone liked it or not. You can bury the past in brick and mortar. You can seal it behind iron doors. You can even convince yourself it's gone, but it's still there, waiting, breathing. And if you hire Nero Wolfe, you better be ready for the day he decides to dig. The city never sleeps, or so they say. But in the brownstone, a different rhythm prevailed. A rhythm of thought, stillness, and restraint. When the mystery of the cellar was finally concluded, when the dust settled and the dust-covered secrets were revealed, everything returned to its steady, deliberate pace. But not before one final conversation. It was a Thursday evening, a few days after the cellar had been unearthed and its secrets, those buried ledgers, those shamed names, had been sealed in the archives. Wolfe had taken his usual seat behind, his desk, large and imposing, surrounded by orchids that bloomed like soft whispers in the corners of the room. He had been reading a book on the ancient trade routes of Europe when I came in, but his eyes flicked up to acknowledge my entrance, with the sharpness I'd come to expect. "Ah, Archie," he said, his tone carrying the faintest edge of amusement. "I trust you finished your toast to victory?" I grinned, leaning against the doorframe. "I've polished off the last of the brandy, and I think I gave everyone the appropriate 'we're done here' speech. But I was just thinking," Wolfe didn't need me to finish, "you were wondering whether they will go away quietly, and whether that one person in the corner of the story, the one who somehow got away with everything, will stay hidden forever." I raised an eyebrow. "Always a man of few words, boss. But you're not wrong." Wolfe set his book aside and steepled his fingers. His chair creaked under his weight, but he remained perfectly still, as he always did when his thoughts were forming. "The cellar," he said, "was always a metaphor. The question was never whether it would be found. The question was whether the people involved, whether Lucinda Byers, Temple, Kelleher, Santorini, or any of the others, could bring themselves to confront what they had hidden away, what they had protected." I didn't say anything. Wolfe rarely required agreement. He was comfortable in his solitude. "But it is not the cellar that fascinates me," he continued. "It is the human desire to conceal, to pretend that something, anything, can be locked away for good." He reached for his beer, but only sipped at it slowly. "Most of them are clever. Lucinda, for instance, she did not want the cellar exposed, not because of the wine, but because of the information in those ledgers. But she wanted to avoid the scandal, the legal mess. She wanted to control what was known, and in doing so she became ensnared by her own deception. And Temple?" Wolfe chuckled, but there was no warmth to it. "Victor Temple, an opportunist of the highest order. If the documents had been worth money, he would have taken them. But once they were found to be of no financial consequence, he played the hero. It is always easier to stand in front of the parade once you've decided which direction it will march." I couldn't help but laugh, despite myself. Wolfe had a way of deflating anyone's pretensions in a single sentence. "But what about Santorini?" I asked. "He's still out there, right? Hiding under the radar, waiting for the next job. What's his angle?" Wolfe sat back, his gaze distant, thoughtful. Perry Santorini is not interested in money. He is interested in power. The kind that is not found in documents or wine bottles, but in the ability to control people, to leverage their secrets for his own gain. He remains an enigma. But as you well know, Archie, one does not follow a shadow for long before it becomes clear which direction it will take. So he'll show up again, I said, and Wolfe nodded. Undoubtedly, he replied, but not yet. Not until it serves him. I stood silently for a moment, watching him. It was always unsettling when Wolfe decided to philosophize, but there was something compelling about it. The way his mind moved, slicing through the superficial layers of human behavior, exposing the raw, sometimes ugly truths underneath. And Lucinda, I asked. She'll return to her life, such as it is, Wolfe said. She is not innocent, Archie. None of them are. But she will carry on. The weight of the past will rest on her shoulders, but only as much as she can bear. She will learn to forget again or convince herself she has. There was a certain finality in his voice, and I knew there was no more to be said on the matter. Turned to head out of the office, but as I reached the door, Wolfe spoke again. One last thing, Archie. I stopped and turned back, expecting more of his usual cryptic insights. Instead, he looked at me with a quiet intensity. Human nature, he said, is not to be underestimated, not the intellect, no, but the need for secrecy, the belief that one can control the past by hiding it. This is the root of most folly. And for all their cleverness, Lucinda and the others failed to see that in the end, they were never in control. They never were. Grinned and shook my head. Well, boss, it seems we all learned a little something about the past and its lingering grip. But I think you'll agree, in the end, we came out ahead. You got your justice, and everyone else, well, they'll just have to deal with their own messes. Wolfe gave me a look that could almost be called indulgent. Indeed, Archie. In the end, it is always the case that the truth has its way. It is just a matter of how long it takes. I chuckled and stepped out of the room, leaving him to his thoughts. There was something comforting in that, knowing that Wolfe, no matter the case, would always find a way to expose the truth, even if it took years. Outside, the city breathed, its noisy pulse a contrast to the stillness inside the brownstone. Life continued, oblivious to the tangled webs of deception that had been unraveled, the secrets that had been laid bare. For now, the Cellar's secrets had been revealed. For now, the players had taken their positions, and Wolfe, through sheer intellect and patience, had won. But I had a feeling the next case was already waiting around the corner, and when it came I would be there, ready to follow him wherever his mind took us next. After all, there was never really a dull moment when you worked for Nero Wolfe. This final section brings the mystery to its natural conclusion, staying true to Nero Wolfe's character, his intellectual dominance, and the theme of human fallibility. It provides a satisfying resolution while maintaining the usual nuanced complexity of the characters. Would you like any adjustments or perhaps a compiled version of the full story for further use?